When word spread that Princess Beatrice had quietly erased Queen Camilla's name from official royal foundation documents, the palace went silent. Not the calm kind of silence, but the kind that carries tension in every breath. A silence that warns of something seismic beneath the surface. It wasn't just a clerical correction or a missing signature. It was a statement, a deliberate act of defiance in a world built on hierarchy and tradition. Beatrice's move was more than rebellion, it was revolution. Overnight whispers slithered through St. James's corridors like smoke after a fire. Some called her courageous, others called her reckless, but one truth echoed in every marble hallway. Beatrice had just chosen a side. It started with a single chilling discovery. A palace aide reviewing foundation records noticed the name missing. Queen Camilla. It was gone, erased without trace. In its place, silence, no replacement, no explanation, just the void where royal authority once stood. Within hours, hushed phone calls rippled across departments. Legal teams were alerted. Private secretaries were summoned. No one wanted to be the first to say it out loud, but everyone knew someone from within had struck a blow. The question wasn't who, but why. Behind closed doors, Beatrice's name surfaced like an unwanted secret. She had always been seen as diplomatic, quiet, beautiful, the royal who stayed away from trouble. Yet this act didn't fit that image. It was precise, intentional, dangerous. To remove a queen's name from royal documents wasn't defiance by accident. It was rebellion by design. And what made it even more shocking was who she seemed to be siding with. Catherine, the Princess of Wales. For months, subtle tension had been building between Beatrice and Camilla. At first, it appeared harmless, a quiet disagreement during a committee meeting, a polite but icy exchange at an event. But insiders had noticed a change in Beatrice. The once reserved princess had started asking questions, challenging decisions, and showing a quiet but unmistakable loyalty toward Catherine. And for a woman like Camilla, who had fought decades to carve her place into the monarchy, that loyalty was an unforgivable betrayal. When the news of the missing name reached Clarence House, aides were in chaos. Calls were made to the Royal Foundation's trustees. Was it a clerical error? Who approved the revisions? But no one had answers. Every record, every audit, every digital signature was clean. It was as if the change had been meant to happen, executed by someone who understood the system far too well. The palace's silence became its loudest confession. Something had gone terribly wrong, and everyone knew Beatrice's fingerprints were metaphorically there, even if no one dared to prove it. The symbolic weight of her decision hit like a thunderclap. In the monarchy, names aren't mere text, they are power. To remove a queen's name from foundation documents was to challenge her legitimacy, to deny her moral authority, and to publicly align oneself against her reign. It wasn't paperwork, it was a message, and the message was clear. Beatrice no longer stood with the crown's chosen hierarchy. She stood with Catherine. The media got wind of it within hours. Anonymous sources leaked fragments to favorite journalists. Headlines erupted overnight. Beatrice defies the Queen Consort. Royal rift deepens. Catherine finds an unexpected ally. Public opinion divided like the monarchy itself. Some hailed her as the voice of a younger, freer royal generation, unafraid to challenge outdated power.
Others branded her reckless, accusing her of disrespecting the throne. Yet even those who criticized her couldn't deny the gravity of what she had done. For the first time in years, someone inside the royal family had drawn a line in the sand and stepped over it.
Inside the palace, no one dared to confront her directly. Beatrice moved through official corridors with calm detachment, her eyes steady, her voice controlled. But beneath that composure was something burning, the knowledge that her actions had consequences far beyond her name. She had disrupted the royal balance, and she knew there would be retaliation. Still, there was no regret. For Beatrice, this wasn't about rebellion for its own sake. It was about truth, about aligning herself with the one woman in the monarchy who understood what it meant to endure quietly and fight gracefully. Catherine. In the gilded halls of tradition and secrecy, alliances are forged not with words, but with acts of courage disguised as chaos. And on that day, when a single royal name vanished from a set of documents, history shifted its course, not with a speech or a scandal, but with a silent act of defiance from a princess who had finally chosen where she stood. But this wasn't a sudden rebellion. It was the climax of a royal storm years in the making, where loyalty, silence, and revenge had all collided behind gilded doors. Behind every royal scandal lies a whisper, and this one had Catherine's name on it. For months she had been stepping back, moving carefully into the shadows, not out of weakness, but strategy. Her retreat from the public eye wasn't surrender, it was an observation. She had watched quietly as the tides inside the palace began to shift, alliances forming in secret, loyalties dissolving without warning. And somewhere in the middle of that chaos, Princess Beatrice found herself caught between admiration and awakening. Because Beatrice's act of defiance, the one that sent shockwaves through royal walls, hadn't emerged from nowhere. It was born from the subtle, deliberate influence of Catherine, the woman who mastered the art of power without ever asking for it. Catherine had once stood at the center of the royal world, radiant and untouchable. But power is fickle in a monarchy where smiles hide daggers. After the king's coronation, Camilla's shadow began to stretch longer, extending into every corridor of influence. Her control over the charitable foundations, the lifeblood of royal goodwill, grew quietly, but absolutely. Catherine's initiatives were sidelined. Her staff was reassigned. Even her speeches were edited until they no longer sounded like her. Slowly her voice was softened, then silenced, until all that remained was the image, polished, distant, and trapped behind protocol. To most, it seemed like she was fading, but those who knew her well saw something else. A woman gathering patience like armor. It was in that silence that Beatrice entered the story. The two women's meetings at Kensington Palace began innocently enough. Afternoon discussions about charities, public appearances, and shared frustrations about bureaucracy. But behind those conversations was something deeper. Beatrice, long overlooked and underestimated, recognized the quiet ache in Catherine's eyes, the pain of being controlled in a world that preached loyalty but practiced exclusion. For the first time, Beatrice saw in Catherine what she'd always wished to find in the monarchy: authenticity, a rare courage disguised as grace. What started as polite support turned into emotional alliance. In private, Beatrice confided how she felt pushed to the sidelines, treated as an accessory to royal formality rather than a woman with her own convictions. Catherine understood. She had lived that same loneliness, smiled through it, endured it with elegance because the crown demanded it. That shared wound of being seen but never truly heard forged something unbreakable between them, a sisterhood not defined by blood but by survival. Together they found quiet rebellion in empathy. They would speak not through confrontation but through conviction. Each small act of mutual support, an approving word in a meeting, a private note of encouragement, became a stitch in their hidden alliance. Catherine didn't need to instruct Beatrice. She simply reminded her that dignity could be its own form of resistance. And in a palace ruled by hierarchy, that was the most dangerous lesson of all. It was this subtle mentorship, this quiet exchange of courage, that planted the seed for Beatrice's eventual stand. Catherine never pushed her to act, but she didn't have to. Her example was louder than any command. She carried herself with a kind of power that didn't need to be declared. It was simply felt. They say Catherine never needed power. She inspired it. And in Beatrice, that inspiration ignited into something unstoppable. But influence never goes unnoticed within the palace walls. For every word of compassion shared in confidence, a whisper found its way to Camilla's ear. And as Beatrice's loyalty deepened, so too did the Queen's suspicion. The storm was no longer on the horizon. It was already building above them. Yet for every whisper of compassion there was a shadow of consequence, and Camilla was listening. Camilla's reign wasn't content with titles or crowns. She wanted something far more enduring: legacy, power that would outlast the whispers of scandal and the flicker of public favor. To her, the crown was not the destination. It was the beginning. In the months following the coronation, she set out to rebuild the monarchy in her image, one decision at a time. And under her hand, the royal foundation, once a neutral force for good, evolved into something else entirely. It became an empire, a carefully curated network of influence wrapped in charity, powered by loyalty, and controlled from behind velvet curtains. Her name appeared everywhere: endowments, initiatives, plaques, and programs. Every document stamped with Her Majesty Queen Camilla served not just as acknowledgement, but as a reminder she wasn't to be overlooked again. Behind this empire stood a council of carefully chosen confidants. Her advisors were not the old guard loyalists who served the late queen. They were new, modern strategists who understood optics better than tradition. They were loyal not to the monarchy, but to her. They built narratives, sculpted press coverage, and redirected royal funding in subtle but powerful ways. With every passing month, Camilla's name became heavier in royal paperwork and lighter in moral restraint. Those who questioned her motives were replaced or silenced. What began as influence soon hardened into authority, and what was once shared became hers alone. Even the king, who had once been her greatest ally, began to sense the imbalance. In private, Charles reportedly voiced his discomfort over her consolidations. Yet in public he smiled beside her, unwilling to ignite another storm. His silence became complicity, and his hesitation her advantage.
Within the palace there was an unspoken understanding. Camilla was the one calling the quiet shots. And though her methods were rarely seen, their results were undeniable. She had woven herself into every strand of the institution so deeply that removing her name from even a single line of official record would feel like tearing fabric from the crown itself. But that's exactly what happened. And when Camilla discovered her name had been erased from the Royal Foundation's core documents, it wasn't confusion that followed, it was fury. Staff later described her outburst as rage behind the drapes. Reports spoke of a queen pacing through Clarence House, demanding explanations, slamming files shut, and insisting that someone will answer for this. For a woman who had built her influence brick by brick, the erasure of her name wasn't a mistake. It was a declaration of war.
For decades, she had fought against public judgment, against being the outsider, the other woman. Every signature, every event, every photograph beside the king was her way of rewriting history, of forcing the world to accept her as the rightful queen. To see her name vanish from an official royal foundation was to relive every rejection she thought she'd left behind. It wasn't just Beatrice's defiance. It was the ghost of Camilla's past coming back to humiliate her. And while the palace worked to contain the story, the damage was already done. The whispers inside the royal staff were relentless. "She's losing her grip," one aide allegedly murmured, "the tide's turning." But others warned that Camilla's anger was never idle. She didn't shout long, she planned. And as soon as she realized who stood behind this act of erasure, her retaliation would be swift, measured, and merciless. Meanwhile, Beatrice's name began to circulate in hushed tones, linked with Catherine's quiet resurgence. To Camilla, it wasn't a coincidence, it was a conspiracy. And in that realization, something shifted inside her. For the first time, the Queen's control felt fragile, her empire vulnerable to a new kind of rebellion, one that didn't come from tabloids or politicians, but from within the royal bloodline itself. The king, though aware of the tension, chose silence once again. He attended meetings, signed papers, and smiled for the cameras, but those closest to him claimed he had grown distant, watching from the edge of a storm he could no longer calm. He loved his wife, but he knew her empire had become dangerous, and now the daughter of his brother, once seen as harmless, had struck the first blow. Camilla had built her legacy on control, but the moment her name disappeared from those documents, her grip began to loosen. What she didn't know yet, what she couldn't see, was that Beatrice's act wasn't merely defiance. It wasn't rebellion for rebellion's sake. It was something far more personal, a reckoning years in the making, born not from power, but from pain. But what Beatrice did wasn't just defiance. It was retaliation for something far more personal, something that began years before this scandal erupted. Buried deep within the royal archives, behind sealed drawers and time-worn folders, lay a letter that was never meant to be seen again. It had no signature, no crest, no official mark, and yet every line of it pulsed with unmistakable royal authority. When Beatrice stumbled upon it, everything changed. It wasn't discovery by chance, it was destiny. The letter's words were sharp, deliberate,
and chillingly familiar in tone. As her eyes moved across the page, she began to understand the truth she'd unknowingly lived under for years, that her mother's fall from royal grace hadn't been a matter of scandal or circumstance. It had been orchestrated. And at the center of that quiet exile stood one name: Camilla. The letter was written in the language of manipulation, couched in politeness, but dripping with intent. It referenced a necessary distancing from the Duchess of York, an act to preserve the dignity of the crown. The tone was careful, political, and coldly efficient, the kind that disguised betrayal as duty. For Beatrice, it was like reading a confession dressed as justification. Every line revealed not only how her mother, Sarah Ferguson, had been pushed away, but who had guided that push. Camilla's influence was woven through the sentences like a ghostly fingerprint, subtle but unmistakable. It wasn't about her mother's mistakes. It was about control, about clearing the board of anyone who didn't fit the new order that Camilla sought to create. When Beatrice put the letter down, her hands were trembling. The room seemed smaller, heavier. Memories began flooding back. The whispers, the exclusion, the way her mother had been treated as a liability rather than family. For years, Beatrice had believed her mother's downfall was her own fault, a punishment for youthful mistakes, for failing to uphold the impossible standards of royal perfection. But in that moment, she saw the truth for what it was. "It was never about me," she whispered to herself. It was about her. The weight of that revelation settled deep inside her. It wasn't just anger that she felt. It was sorrow, the kind that comes from realizing you've been protecting those who never protected you.
Catherine was the first person she turned to. The Princess of Wales listened in quiet empathy, her expression soft, but her voice steady. She didn't feed Beatrice's fury, she guided it. "Grace doesn't mean silence," she said gently. "It means knowing when to speak and when to act." It was advice that struck deeper than Beatrice expected. In Catherine's calm, she found clarity. In her restraint, she found strength. From that night on, Beatrice's silence was no longer submission. It was preparation. She carried the letter close, not as evidence, but as a reminder of the truth she could no longer ignore. Every time she attended a royal event, every time she smiled for the cameras or greeted Camilla with practiced grace, she felt the paper's weight in her conscience. It was the proof that silence, though noble in theory, often protects the wrong people. The burden of that secret began to transform her. No longer the quiet princess, content to observe from the sidelines, Beatrice started to see herself as something more, a keeper of truth in a house built on concealment. The letter had done more than expose Camilla's deceit. It had awakened something within her, the realization that justice in the monarchy wasn't granted, it was taken. That night, as she stared out of her Kensington window, the city lights below flickering like whispers, she made a silent vow, not for revenge, but for restoration, to reclaim her mother's dignity and her own voice. The monarchy had silenced one Ferguson, it would not silence another. And though no one else knew it yet, the quiet princess had already made her choice. That was the night she stopped being a silent princess and became a royal disruptor. What began as an act of emotion soon became something far greater, a calculated rebellion against a crown of control. Beatrice's discovery of the letter had changed her, but what followed changed the monarchy. In the silence of royal nights, beneath the weight of secrets and old betrayals, she began what palace insiders would later call Operation Erase Camilla. It wasn't planned in rage, it was born of purpose, precise, deliberate, and dangerous. She wasn't just standing up for her mother anymore. She was dismantling a system that had weaponized silence for too long. It started with a single document, the Royal Foundation's Charter. Reviewed annually, it was due for revisions, a routine administrative process, the kind no one paid much attention to, except Beatrice. The foundation, now deeply under Camilla's influence, had become the Queen's pride, her lasting mark on the institution. But it also served as a quiet fortress for her authority. Beatrice knew this, and she knew where to begin. Late at night, she combed through archived records, financial filings, and governance papers. For weeks, she studied the machinery of royal charity, not as a supporter, but as a strategist. Every signature, every trustee approval, every name listed under royal patronage told her one thing: Camilla had embedded herself everywhere. And to dismantle that, Beatrice couldn't just make a statement. She needed to pull a thread that would unravel everything. When the moment came, Beatrice reviewed every line herself. It wasn't about ego. It was about justice, disguised as procedure. She never signed her name because she didn't need to. The documents were quietly passed through internal channels, marked for trustee approval. And by the time the Royal Foundation's annual report was finalized, Camilla's name, the symbol of her dominance, was gone, erased from the records without fanfare or explanation. Catherine knew. She had known all along. Though she never instructed, she understood the intent. In one of their last private conversations before the change went through, Catherine had said only 6 words. "Do what must be done, Beatrice." It wasn't permission, it was faith, a quiet acknowledgement that some battles had to be fought without words, without applause. For Catherine, it was survival. For Beatrice, it was redemption. When the morning came, the impact was instant. Clarence House was in chaos. Advisors flooded offices, phones rang endlessly, and the King's private secretary demanded answers no one could give. Every attempt to trace permission had stalled. Legal teams reviewed the documents again and again, unable to find a single irregularity. Everything was official, signed, approved, and irreversible. Yet one name was conspicuously missing: Queen Camilla. The whispers began almost immediately. It's a clerical oversight, a digital error, a sabotage. But those who worked closely with royalty knew better. This wasn't an accident. It was intent. And in the corridors of power, that intent had a name: Beatrice. By noon, the word mutiny was being whispered by staff who'd never dared to use it before. Someone had turned against the crown, not through scandal or speech, but through silence and ink. As the realization spread, so did the fear.
If Camilla's control could be erased with a few documents, what else could be undone? What other truths could be rewritten? The palace was no longer a fortress, it was a chessboard, and Beatrice had just made the first move against the Queen herself. But in a world where power never yields quietly, every move demands a countermove. And while Beatrice believed she had restored balance, the Queen she had defied was not one to suffer humiliation in silence. Because behind those closed doors, as panic turned into rage, Camilla was already preparing her response. But for every move in this royal chess game, there was a countermove, and Camilla was about to strike back with fury. For Camilla, this wasn't about paperwork, it was about power. And when power is threatened, the crown bites back. The moment she learned her name had been erased from the Royal Foundation's records, something inside her snapped. The fury that had once been whispered about became real, roaring through the corridors of Clarence's house like a gathering storm. Overnight, she summoned her inner circle, courtiers, strategists, and her most loyal press contacts. If Beatrice had launched a quiet rebellion, Camilla would answer with noise. Every whisper would be turned into a headline. Every act of defiance would be rewritten as disgrace. The first strike came swiftly. A series of leaks appeared in the tabloids, each more damaging than the last. Sources described Beatrice as impulsive, unstable, even jealous of Camilla's position. Anonymous insiders hinted that she had overstepped royal boundaries, acting beyond her station to interfere in foundation affairs.
What Beatrice had done in silence, out of conviction, was now being painted as a reckless act of vanity. The narrative was ruthless, calculated, and effective. Within days, the public was no longer talking about Camilla's missing name. They were talking about Beatrice's supposed arrogance. The Queen Consort had done what she always did best, shifted the light away from her shadow. The press devoured the story, spinning it into something scandalous and shallow. Headlines framed it as a feud between the jealous women of Windsor. To outsiders, it was nothing more than a royal catfight, emotion over reason, drama over dignity. But those within the palace knew the truth. This wasn't a feud born from jealousy, it was a war born from principle. Still, perception is a powerful weapon, and Camilla knew how to wield it better than anyone. With each passing day, Beatrice's public image began to fracture. Commentators debated her motives, pundits questioned her loyalty, and the very public she had once quietly served began to doubt her intentions. Meanwhile, Catherine chose silence, and that silence spoke louder than words. Her refusal to comment, her absence from events, her calm restraint amid chaos, it all became a source of intrigue. To some, it was a sign of solidarity with Beatrice. To others, it was a quiet betrayal. But Catherine understood something no one else did. Sometimes silence is not surrender, it's strategy. She knew the storm would burn itself out, and when it did, truth would remain. But until then, she couldn't risk exposing herself to the same flames. Behind closed doors, things got murkier. The Royal Foundation, under pressure from Camilla's allies, announced an official review of its documents. It was a public gesture of control and a signal that order would be restored. In truth, it was little more than theater, a symbolic way of reasserting Camilla's dominance. But the damage had been done. The foundation that once stood for unity now symbolized division. Inside its offices, staff walked on eggshells, fearful of being seen speaking to the wrong royal camp. What had once been an institution of purpose was now a battlefield of allegiances. And in the middle of that battlefield stood the king, torn between his wife and his niece. For Charles, the conflict was personal. He had watched both women, each representing a different version of the monarchy he was sworn to uphold. One wielded tradition like a weapon, the other sought truth through defiance. The king's heart leaned toward Beatrice's courage, but his duty chained him to Camilla's crown. His silence, though meant to preserve peace, only deepened the fracture within his family. Camilla's retaliation had been brutal, but not flawless. In her pursuit to crush Beatrice's credibility, she revealed her own fear, that her reign wasn't as secure as she wanted the world to believe. Because for all her power, she couldn't erase the reason behind Beatrice's act. She could bury the truth beneath gossip, but she couldn't destroy it. It lingered in whispers, in knowing glances, in the unease that now haunted the palace halls. But while Camilla fought in the press, Beatrice and Catherine were fighting for something far greater: truth, legacy, and the right to choose loyalty over obedience. No cameras, no witnesses, just 3 women behind closed doors: Catherine, Beatrice, and Camilla. It was the confrontation no one was ever meant to see, a meeting whispered into existence by King Charles himself, desperate to silence the feud that had begun tearing his family apart. What was meant to be a quiet reconciliation became a collision of willpower, pride, and buried truth.
The king had hoped that bringing them together would restore peace. Instead, it exposed the fault lines that could no longer be hidden. The meeting took place under the pretense of privacy, a final attempt to mend what the press had already turned into a spectacle. But even before words were exchanged, the atmosphere was electric with tension. Camilla arrived determined to reclaim her authority. She wasn't there to make peace, she was there to reassert control. For her, Beatrice's defiance wasn't just betrayal, it was insubordination. And Catherine's silence, once seen as elegance, now felt like quiet rebellion. To Camilla, both women had crossed a line that could not go unchallenged. From the moment Camilla spoke, her tone was cold, rehearsed, and heavy with dominance. She demanded an explanation, cloaking her anger in the language of royal decorum. "You've brought disgrace to this family," she began, her words sharp and measured. But Beatrice didn't bow, not this time. The timid royal who once avoided conflict met the queen's glare with steady eyes. "Disgrace?" she replied softly. "I corrected one." The sentence cut through the room like glass. What followed was not a debate. It was an unraveling. Camilla rose from her chair, her composure cracking, accusing Beatrice of undermining the monarchy, of aligning with Catherine to humiliate the crown. But Beatrice stood firm, refusing to retreat into the silence that had once protected others and buried her own truth. Catherine, ever composed, tried to steady the room. Her voice was calm, even compassionate, but firm. She didn't deny the bond she shared with Beatrice, nor did she apologize for it. Instead, she reminded Camilla that loyalty was not obedience, that the monarchy's strength came from integrity, not intimidation. Yet the more she spoke, the more Camilla's fury deepened. To her, Catherine's restraint was arrogance, a quiet defiance that stung far more than open hostility. The queen's voice rose, Catherine's never did. It was a duel of tempers and temperament, one wielding outrage, the other wielding composure. Then came the moment that changed everything. Beatrice reached into her bag and placed a sealed envelope on the table. "If you want the truth," she said, her voice trembling but steady, "it's here." The implication was explosive. Rumors later spread that the envelope contained proof. A copy of the letter, the one linking Camilla to the decision that destroyed Beatrice's mother's royal standing. Camilla's expression hardened. Catherine looked away. For a few long seconds, no one spoke. The weight of what hung between them was too heavy for words. When Camilla finally responded, her tone was cold, enveloped in calm. "You think you understand the monarchy," she said slowly, "but you don't speak for it." Beatrice's reply was quiet, but it shook the walls of Windsor. "Neither do you anymore." That was the sentence that ended everything. Not just the meeting, but the illusion that this family still stood united behind one vision of the crown. The women left the room separately. There were no statements, no press briefings, no official acknowledgement that the meeting had ever taken place. But those who worked closest to the royals described what came next, an eerie silence that stretched for days. No public appearances, no photographs, no smiles. The palace corridors felt heavy, as if they too were holding their breath. That silence wasn't peace. It was the calm before the storm that would reshape the royal family's image forever. Once the truth was out, there was no controlling the narrative. The palace, once an unshakable fortress of silence, found itself surrounded by noise, the kind that couldn't be ignored, censored, or spun into civility. The story had escaped its gilded walls, spreading like wildfire across headlines and social feeds. Every outlet had its version, every pundit had a theory, and every royal watcher had already chosen a side. What began as a quiet act of defiance had become a national reckoning.
And at the center of it all stood Princess Beatrice, no longer the background royal, no longer the obedient niece, but the woman who had dared to confront the monarchy's quiet tyranny. The media called it the Royal Betrayal Files. They dissected every rumor, every timeline, every hidden motive. The letter resurfaced through leaks, whispered from unnamed insiders. For the first time, the world saw Beatrice not as a mistake or a scandal, but as a woman with purpose. Her approval ratings soared, especially among younger generations who saw in her a symbol of courage, a royal willing to challenge the unspoken rules that had governed the House of Windsor for decades. Hashtags spread like wildfire. Hashtag Beatrice the Brave. Hashtag Truth over Tradition. To a monarchy that had thrived on discretion and control, this was the most dangerous rebellion of all, one built on empathy, integrity, and transparency. Catherine's response was subtle, but unmistakable. She didn't speak a word publicly, yet her actions spoke volumes. She was photographed walking alongside Beatrice at a charity event days after the scandal erupted, both women smiling with quiet solidarity. To the trained eye, it was more than coincidence. It was a message, a calm, deliberate display of unity that said, "We stand together." For Catherine, it was the culmination of years of quiet strength, her support delivered not through statements, but through presence. And though she never publicly addressed the controversy, her silence became an endorsement in itself, the kind that Camilla couldn't counter with press or protocol. Meanwhile, the Queen Consort retreated from view. Officially, it was for health reasons. Unofficially, it was surrender. Courtiers avoided her chambers. Her once dominant press team went silent. For the first time, Camilla was no longer dictating the story. She was enduring. Every newspaper headline, every whisper in Parliament, every late-night talk show monologue chipped away at the illusion of her unshakable influence. The woman who controlled the royal narrative for years now found herself exiled by the very weapon she once wielded, public perception. King Charles remained outwardly neutral, but those close to him said his silence carried meaning. Behind closed doors, he reportedly acknowledged that Beatrice's actions, though reckless, had brought needed honesty. Yet the king understood the danger of choosing sides. To publicly defend his niece would be to undermine his wife. To condemn her would fracture his family even further. And so, like every monarch before him, he chose the one tool that had preserved the throne for centuries: restraint. But even his restraint couldn't hide the truth. The public saw what the palace would never admit. The monarchy was bleeding from within. The old image of royal unity had shattered. The facade of harmony that had survived scandal after scandal was now slipping away under the weight of one woman's courage. And in that chaos, the headlines, the leaks, the televised debates, Beatrice found something extraordinary. She wasn't broken by the storm. She stood taller in it, not as a rebel tearing down tradition, but as a reformer, forcing it to evolve. And yet through the chaos, Beatrice stood taller, not as a rebel, but as a reformer. When the dust finally settled, something extraordinary had happened. The monarchy hadn't collapsed, as many predicted. It had evolved. The storm that began with one unsigned letter and one erased name had forced the royal institution to look at itself in the mirror. And for the first time in generations, it didn't like what it saw. What Beatrice had done, whether seen as rebellion or reform, had cracked open the facade of untouchable perfection.
Out of the chaos, a new kind of monarchy began to emerge, one less about preservation and more about purpose. Her defiance, once condemned, had become the spark for something deeper: renewal. The royal foundation, once Camilla's fortress of influence, underwent a quiet but powerful transformation. After months of internal scrutiny and public pressure, it was restructured under new leadership. Words like transparency, accountability, and inclusivity became more than just public relations language. They became policy. Camilla's inner circle, once untouchable, began to dissolve. Trustees loyal to her influence stepped down, replaced by reform-minded figures with a vision more aligned with modern Britain. The foundation's focus shifted from maintaining royal prestige to restoring public trust. For the first time in years, the monarchy seemed to be listening. At the heart of this shift were two women who had once been underestimated: Catherine and Beatrice. Away from the spotlight,
They began to rebuild, quietly, deliberately, together. They championed causes stripped of pomp, education for women, mental health, child welfare, causes rooted in empathy rather than optics. Behind closed doors, they became an unlikely force of unity, representing a future where strength didn't need to be loud to be powerful. They weren't rewriting the rules of the monarchy, they were rewriting its soul. What had once divided them from the rest of the royal family now set them apart as its moral compass. Meanwhile, Camilla's influence faded into the background. Her faction, the advisors, press handlers, and social power brokers who once controlled the royal narrative began to lose relevance. Her health retreat extended into months of quiet withdrawal. The woman who once ruled through whispers now found herself surrounded by silence. And though the palace never issued a statement, the message was clear. Her era of dominance had ended. Power had shifted, not through confrontation, but through consequence. Beatrice's transformation was perhaps the most striking of all. The forgotten princess, once mocked by tabloids and overlooked by history, became something entirely new. The people's voice within the monarchy. Her courage, once branded as reckless, resonated with those who had long seen the royal family as distant and cold. She had shown that truth could exist alongside tradition, and that loyalty wasn't blind obedience, but the courage to question when something felt wrong. For the first time, her name stood not behind others, but beside them. Public opinion began to change. The younger generation, once apathetic toward the royal institution, saw in Beatrice and Catherine a glimpse of authenticity. They weren't figureheads, they were human. Their strength came not from titles, but integrity. The monarchy's image, once tarnished by secrecy, began to heal under the weight of transparency. The walls that once separated the crown from the people seemed thinner now, less impenetrable, more honest. This wasn't the end of the monarchy, it was its rebirth. The old world of silence and submission had given way to something more real, more reflective of the world it claimed to represent. The House of Windsor had been forced to evolve, not through decree, but through defiance. And it was the women, once silenced, dismissed, and underestimated, who carried that evolution forward. The palace may never admit it, but history will show that the day Beatrice removed Camilla's name wasn't defiance.